So yeah, the most important historical building in my area burnt down, and I was there to photograph it. The building in question is the Bidwell Mansion, and its destruction by arson has been a real flashpoint within the community. The fire was started at 3 a.m. on December 11th, 2024, and I actually happened to be awake with jet lag at the time, so I scurried on over there. And for the most part, I was pretty much one of the only photographers there, maybe the only photographer there at the time. And although the photos aren't all that amazing, they are still really near and dear to me just because of their historic significance. And I actually shot this with my Mamiya 6 and pretty much only got one roll in before the fire really started to die down. Now let's zoom out. Over the past year or so, I've really been diving headfirst in on a project really revolving around the history in Northern California between Euro-Americans and Native Americans. And this has brought me to the far reaches of the state, from Mount Shasta to the Nevada border and along the winding Sacramento River. One of the topics that's really come up just doing this project happens to be that of fire. Fire is really relevant to the history between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in the state, and it's one that's extremely relevant today. Within my local community alone, since 2018, you're talking over 1 million acres burnt, pretty much tens of thousands of houses lost, almost 100 people dead in the long run. Really relevant topic. So the destruction of this mansion by fire in the winter really just feels like a shit cherry on top of a shit, banana sundae the size of Lake Tahoe. With that being said, the destruction of the mansion opens up a lot of old wounds within the community, and these wounds have to do with the relationship between Native Americans, Euro-Americans, and pretty much my project. So for that reason, let's actually go back now to the ruins of the mansion. Let's photograph it, and let's talk about the history of the mansion's original owners, John and Annie Bidwell. So it's a beautiful morning here at Bidwell Mansion. We still have some nice morning light, and I brought along my Hasselblad 500cm as well as some expired Ilford FP4 Plus. For the most part, I figure if this film doesn't turn out too well, I can just come back and shoot another morning. I still have plenty more opportunities, but otherwise, I'm glad to finally have made it out here. They had a bunch of collapsed scaffolding around the building right after the fire. That's all cleared away, so it's a pretty clean scene with open lines of view. Now, as I load up this expired film, let's dive into some history here and talk about John Bidwell, who's pretty much like the Jedediah Springfield of my area. He helped establish the communities of Bidwell Bar as well as Chico, which is now a pretty sizable city of 100,000+. And he also created or helped create the local university here, Chico State University. And then he donated a lot of his land to become what is now Bidwell Park, which is one of the larger city parks in the whole country, and it is really beautiful, just the crown jewel of the city. And if you've seen a few of my videos, then you'll know I go there quite a bit to photograph. Despite these contributions to the community, John and Annie Bidwell do have a somewhat complicated legacy, and a lot of that has to do with their relationship with Native Americans. A lot of people see them pretty much as being slave masters, while a lot of people see them as being the benevolent patriarch for all these local settlers at the time, as well as for the local Mechoopda tribe. And this is something I've really read about, researched, and written about quite a bit in graduate school in the past, ad nauseum basically. So I'm going to try and take a little bit more of a middle of the road approach here when viewing this controversial subject like John Bidwell, and really an interesting subject in general. So yeah, this expired Ilford really came out crispy, which kind of sucks. I have had some good luck with black and white expired film in the past, so I was hoping for the best in this case, but it's at least 30 to 40 years old, so I really shouldn't act surprised. Overall, I quite like the contrast and grain of these photos. For expired film, the grain really isn't all that strong with this Ilford film, but you do have this modeling all over. And what that is essentially either from moisture getting into the film or from just the backing paper essentially imprinting onto the negative itself. So the modeling is really what is messing these photos up, and that's a real shame. This is a photo that I really like in particular, even though the modeling is really strong for it. But just overall, the composition and the lighting is quite nice in my mind. And then actually, I think that modeling does make this photo almost look like it was an image out of the 1800s or so. It really fits in with a lot of the photos I've been sharing today. With my roll at an end and the midday light really starting to hit, I decided to call it a day. For the most part, this expired film did not turn out well, and the photos in general didn't turn out well, but it's not the end of the world because this was more of an exploratory outing to find some more compositions going forward. And because this mansion is so close to where I live, I figured I'd turn around the next week and try it again. Before I head out to shoot again though, let's talk once more about the Bidwells. John Bidwell first arrived in California in 1841, making him one of the first Americans in the whole area. This area belonged to Mexico at the time as part of Alta California, and because he was an early settler, he actually got a large bit of land from the Mexican government, and this combined with really getting rich from the gold rush made him a lot of money and helped him grow what would become a very large agricultural based empire, which also really relied upon Mechoopda Maidu labor. So yeah, this Mechoopda Maidu labor was really crucial to his success as a businessman, as a rancher. And according to the Mechoopda tribe, he did provide them with homes, and he did provide them with somewhat fair wages at the time, as well as protection from the local settler population, which is really outwardly violent towards Native Americans in general. For example, in 1863, Butte County, the county where Bidwell's ranch is, decided to pretty much kick out all of the Native Americans in the area. It was a really bloody period of time in particular, and John Bidwell fought tooth and nail to make sure that the local Mechoopda Maidu could remain where they are. And of course, this is entirely an altruistic decision by him to protect them. Of course, that's pretty much his whole labor base there, so he doesn't want them to get kicked out. But nonetheless, it did help protect the Mechoopda Maidu at the time. It was around this time it's actually argued that John Bidwell had a Mechoopda wife named Nupani, and this really reflects his laissez-faire attitude towards the Mechoopda in general, really allowing them to continue their cultural practices in the area. But this did end in around 1868 when he married Annie Bidwell from back east, and she really had a more Christian crusader attitude about her and really just followed a really decades-long program of forced assimilation for the local Mechoopda Maidu. 1868 also marked the year that Bidwell Mansion was completed, and it was a really extravagant building for the time. And because of the Bidwell's prominence, it was also a place that saw quite a few dignitaries, including President Rutherford B. Hayes, General William Tecumseh Sherman, John Muir, and Susan B. Anthony. So really a lot of prominent people were visiting the Bidwells at this time. And the Bidwells actually remained in that mansion until their deaths, which John died in 1900 and then Annie in 1918. Well, it is another morning here at the mansion. I got my Pentax 6.7 along and some Portra 400 this time. Figured I'd cover my bases here, get a little bit of a mixture of both the previous black and white as well as this color, and add some wider lenses just to find different compositions. But overall, it's a nice morning at least. The light's good, and I did actually bring a stool along so I can get a little bit better of a perspective over this big fence. As you can see, this Portra 400 is definitely not expired. It delivers fairly neutral results with fairly wide exposure latitude, and that's precisely what I want when photographing these ruins. Admittedly, these are all fairly wide-angle shots of the mansion ruins so far, and I'm not that crazy about most of them. And I'm pretty used to being constrained physically when it comes to shooting landscapes or townscapes, but this fence really just was making it difficult to find good compositions, even with the latter, and even with me having a bunch of different focal length lenses. It was just a difficult time on this second day finding compositions that I like. And since I'm being a Debbie Downer at the moment, we might as well dive back into the history of the mansion. For the most part, I could spend another hour talking about the Bidwells and their controversial legacy, but I think I would best summarize it by looking at the words of local historian John Magliari, professor at Chico State, when he says that the Bidwells, and John in particular, really successfully played the role as both protector and exploiter. Within the context of the time, I would say that John Bidwell was less hostile towards Native Americans compared to many other settlers in California. He actually paid his labor, and when you compare that to John Sutter, for example, John Sutter enslaved Native Americans and fed them from cattle troughs, so there's a disparity there, but I don't think that makes John Bidwell safe from judgment. John Bidwell worked to give reservation lands to Native American tribes in California, while at the same time undermining a lot of the Mechoopda Maidu's own efforts for their own reservation. And then as early as 1850, John Bidwell pushed for growing Native American civil rights. While if you look at the Mechoopda Maidu at his ranch, he really had this program of forced assimilation that extinguished a lot of the Mechoopda cultural practices. And then just going beyond that, you have him really standing up for the Mechoopda, preventing any sort of frontier violence from befalling them at the hands of local white settlers. But there are some cases, although it's really unclear at this point to what extent he might have been active in violence towards other Native American tribes. All this goes to show just how complex and dynamic this history with the Bidwells and just with Native Americans in Northern California is in general. But it is a history that's ever changing. There's always a lot of new literature coming out about the subject, and it's one that I really wanted to share with you all and continue to share with you all as it does relate to my project as well. Although this photo isn't anything remarkable, it might be my favorite from the day. Just these textures from the ruins, as well as the subtle lighting differences and how that's portrayed by Portra 400, I do think that it works. But with that being said, being on the ground level, even with the ladder, and having that upward looking perspective, I'm not too crazy about that, but unfortunately there's not much I can do about it. And with this photo, I was once again done with my roll of film and done for the day. Overall, I would say it was not a spectacular day of shooting. It was pretty lackluster if you ask me, but nonetheless, this is a location that's close by, and I find it to be a necessary step towards finding a photo of this mansion in its state of ruin and then using it for my project. Now, a lot can still happen. These ruins could get torn down any day, could fall down any day, or could get covered up in scaffolding, so I really shouldn't dilly-dally in that regard. But nonetheless, even if it wasn't a successful day of finding a specific project photo, it was still part of that necessary just working your way up when you're wanting to really nail the photos for a project. So can't say it was a day wasted. Nonetheless, I thought it was a great opportunity to teach you some of the history about the mansion, about the Bidwells, and the controversy that surrounds it. Regardless of where you may stand with this controversial history and whether you agree with my assessment of said history, I do hope that you enjoyed or learned something from the video, and I do plan on diving into more of this local history related to my project in the future.